to Melbourne. I'd gotten studied ecology United States and then studied at Deakin here, and I've been working as a consultant in bush regenerator since 1992 for my company Practical Ecology, in which we do, ironically, I started it thinking I'd just do restoration work, but since I could write reports and identify things, people sucked me into consulting, and then I got pulled into native veg assessments and how to do offsets. Now, and I'll state up front too that my other business, I actually have a partnership with someone in which we run a company called Bush Blocks, and we actually do offsets. And I've done offsets. We bought our first offset about 10 years ago. So I experienced that bit too. I do call myself a walking conflict of interest, because when you do this, when you make offsets and acquire offsets for, calculate offsets, help acquire offsets for people, give advice about offsets, and then sometimes make them, and then often sell them, you end up being a conflict of interest, a walking conflict of interest. But what I try to address all that, and I'll explain more about basically by being upfront and saying, yes, that's what I do. So that's where I come from offsets. I think offsets are both good and bad, and I'll explain why. Now, Adrian asked me, I think it was last Wednesday or Thursday, if I could be a speaker. So I've organized one page of my share screen. The one thing I've organized for my PowerPoint is, as you see it, is here's the topics I'll try to cover. And how I'll do it is, I haven't had much time to put anything formal together besides my talk outline, but I will be I'll go through the talk outline, basically introduce offsets, some of the history, talk about the state system, which is really quite different to the federal system, which I'll go into. And then I'll also talk about some of the problems as I see them, and some of the questions, some of the things, that second to last bullet point is about where I think government should be about some permits for some ecosystems. And maybe I'll take a while to get there, but I'll talk about the positive outcomes of offsetting too, because it wouldn't be the same way. We wouldn't be doing some good conservation work without offsetting as a concept. It just maybe is taken a bit far. So that's kind of the spread. I don't mind being interrupted by questions as you go. I'll have a look at chat when it comes and so on. But yeah, what I'll try to do tonight is actually introduce you to the history and mechanics of offsets, to help you. It's such a huge, complicated subject, but what I'll try to do is from the perspective of how do you use offsets to actually do good conservation work, and to maybe resist development proposals that you don't like. I realize that's what Grassy Plains Network tends to be about, so I'll cater to your interest. Now, let me, and that's why my first topic here tonight is understanding how offsets work is actually quite important, because the problem of offsets allow politicians and developers to feel better about proposing to destroy native vegetation. And I'll even highlight, I remember the press conference that Dan Andrews fronted for the Northeast Link. And he literally, I am paraphrasing a bit here, but he almost literally said, we're going to spend billions of dollars building this amazing road, and you're all going to have less driving time, and we're going to finish it, but don't worry about the environment. We're going to do offsets. And I still say that in my memory, that press conference is this kind of mark in my head about how the powers that be don't want us to see offsets, but we probably need to see their limits. and often they're essentially used as, in some ways, to make us all feel better about continuing to have lots of development, and sometimes development in sensitive places. So let me go into the theory of biodiversity offsets. They've been, the theory is that when you clear native vegetation, you should offset that biodiversity loss, that flora and fauna, that habitat, with legal protection and improvement of habitat elsewhere. Now, usually there should be some like for like. Like for like is a very interesting issue here, because if you have if you have like for like that's very close, for example, that you're destroying native grassland, you need a native grassland offset, that kind of frustrates the developers and the facilitators of development, because it's sometimes harder to get such offsets. But if you keep the offsetting system rather general and graduated, then maybe different levels of like for like depending on the site of loss, then maybe it's easier to get permits granted for basically destroying habitat. And that's actually what the state system is kind of based on. Let me get back to that in a few minutes, because I do want to talk about history first. And I'm not sure on this point, I'm not sure if we're lucky. Actually, some days I feel lucky about this point. But there's been 2 national offset conferences in Australia. One was right before COVID in 2019, and the other one was last year in Canberra, last July or August in Canberra. So there's been 2 national conferences. They were quite amazing events in some ways. Representatives of every single state got up and talked about their systems, or lack of systems, as the case may be. I actually commented at the time when Queensland presented, my joke was they have the kind of offset system that you have when you don't want one, because it hardly applies to anything except because the Commonwealth EPBC Act picks it all up. In Tasmania, they hardly require permits for native veg removal. So if you don't begin with requiring native veg permits for native veg removal in the planning system, you can't require offsets. There's no mechanism. So anyway, that's some of the history. In Victoria, we were actually the first, and why I brought up the conferences in Canberra is we were the first jurisdiction in the world to initiate biodiversity offsets as a legal requirement in planning. This was 2003. We know this. In one of the national offset conferences, a lecturer from California came over and presented on offsets around the world, and he basically gave me that tidbit. I didn't do the work he did. I forget his name now, but he did the work of saying, yeah, Victoria was the first in the world to have a biodiversity offset system put into place. From 2003, that was under net gain. This is another important bit of history, is that some of you will remember, I'm sure, depending on your age and what you were doing, but offsets came in with the native veg framework in 2003, and then the net gain policy. And it was a bit confusing at the time, and even through net gain, up until net gain and native veg framework applied till 2013. And they, the like for like in net gain was fairly, in the native veg framework, was quite strong, in that you needed very similar EVCs, that you needed. It was also graduated like for like, is that if it was a least concern EVC, ecological vegetation class, you could offset with many divergent types, similar but divergent. But the rarer and the more significant a loss became, the more like for like was required. And in my hindsight, I'd say that the native veg framework got it right. Now, the bit of history to flow into is, of course, 2013, the Liberals come into power, and Matthew Guy was the planning minister, and he completely changed the system. and really made it much more flexible for development, because he was a bit of a knee-jerk reaction, but there's various issues that I didn't think were problematic. I operated through all these periods. So, for example, one of the issues that Mr. Guy criticized when he changed the system in 2013 from the native veg framework was there's a system of the best habitat and the remaining habitat. So if you had threatened species on your site of loss, you needed, and it was their best habitat, you needed to have the offset needed to be similar, have similar habitat that was could be classified as the best habitat for that rare species. Now, one of the critiques Mr. Guy said of the old system in 2013 of the native veg framework was, well, that was confusing. Well, it wasn't really. I think in 100 or 200 applications I did over 10 years, DELWIP, or whatever their name was at the time, DSE or DNRE, they only disagreed with our best and remaining habitat assessments for rare species for offset sites once. So there was no confusion. It was just basically frustrating to developers that they had to do this. It was just a high bar that was hard to meet. So I'll get back to, in 2013, the system was changed completely, and it's a mapping exercise today. And I'll get to show you some of this, is that the state is divided up into 3 risk levels, level 1, 2, and 3. 1 is the lowest, that's most of the state, probably 95%, or something like that, 95%. And then the 2nd and 3rd levels are where native veg is more significant. I'm not sure where they came up with this mapping. It does go, the current system put in place in 2013 is very reliant on modeled data. Now, there is a joke about modeled data from GIS, and GIS is, well, there's a couple jokes I can trot out here. One, if you talk about GIS, there is an old phrase, shit data in, shit data out, shit information out. Now, am I classifying what the Victorian state government publishes as their GIS layers as shit? Well, kind of. It's getting old at least, but it's more about the other joke about GIS and modeling in mapping is modeling's all well and good. But it's not correct. It's modeling. It's useful, but it's not correct. It's modeling. Fortunately, the system, the offset, the native veg assessment system for in Victoria under the current scheme from 2013, it actually changed in 2017, but really was just tweaked a little bit. So, for example, large trees, Mr. Guy in 2013 decided that large trees didn't need to be counted, but it was actually in the review that Labor did when they got back in, all the ecologists said, are you crazy? You need to account for large old trees. They're, a third of all mammals, half of all Australian mammals need them. A third of all Australian birds need hollows in big trees. 15% of reptiles need hollows, are reliant on hollows in trees. So it was very important that the large trees come back. Endangered EVCs came back in as well. Ironically, through these 3 stages, the same assessment system on the ground that we do as ecological consultants still stayed, is that we do habitat zones, we determine EVCs, and then we do habitat scoring. And then that turns into use under native veg framework, it turned into habitat hectares. But now the system is quite a bit different. Let me go a little bit more into, I'll go into the Victorian Planning and Environment Act, because that's where it comes from. So this next point, and since I'm still sharing, the most critical the most critical thing in the whole planning scheme. Now, this is clause 52.17. And this is where you go. This bit of the planning scheme, I've only included here 52.17 because it is the clause that basically requires a permit for native veg removal. And as you can see, this is where the hierarchy or the mitigation hierarchy is placed. Now,
excuse me, Lincoln, I don't think we can, if you're showing us clause 52.17, we can't see that at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you see?
We're just looking at introduction to biodiversity offsets in Victoria, your original slide.
Okay, thank you for that. I might stop sharing that. And then I'll go back to my, now can you see, let's see, you would think after a few years of this that I would be incredibly flash, wouldn't you, on Zoom? Okay, can you see that now?
Yes.
So clause 52.17 is the most important clause in the Victorian planning scheme under the state system, because it basically requires a permit for native veg removal. There are bucket loads of exemptions, which I'll get into, but this is most important. Now, I'm only going to stop here to explain to all of you, but this hierarchy is elsewhere too. It's in clause 12 something, which is the state section of the planning scheme. 52.17 is the state section of the planning scheme too, meaning it applies everywhere in this. It applies in every municipality. How the Planning and Environment Act works is it'll have a bunch of local sections that will vary, but the local sections still use all the framework and all the tools, a certain set of linguistic of language and of different zones and different overlays and so on. But the local section of the planning scheme essentially is a locally developed framework for planning. What I want to make the point here too is that this hierarchy of avoid, minimize, and offset it's in clause 12. I'll make the point too, offsets aren't mentioned very often, but in the planning scheme, but there are plenty of references of protecting biodiversity. So if you all get involved in local in planning permits or rezonings and that kind of thing, I do like to emphasize there's plenty of references to protecting biodiversity throughout the planning scheme in so many provisions. And my point, I often make the point, it seems like a lot of decision makers aren't reading them sometimes, aren't reading all those references. But that's partially because there's another old joke I like to repeat that I got I forget from who, but the Planning and Environment Act under the Victorian state legislation could be called the Victorian Planning and Development Act, because let's be clear, and it's very clear in the act itself that facilitating appropriate development is part of it. But also protecting values like the environment through that process is also important. So in a sense, what they try to do, what is tried to happen is a balance between development and protection of values. So I'll get back to native veg in 52.17. The hierarchy is very important. The mitigation hierarchy guides everything. So as you can see here, it's avoid the removal, destruction, or lopping of native vegetation, minimize impacts, and then provide an offset. And that order is actually quite important. Is the order is the obligation of a proponent of an action that would clear native vegetation. And you need to avoid first, minimize next, and provide an offset if it's reasonable to do so. Now, I'm summarizing quite a few different VCAT decisions and so on, because at first it wasn't so clear that you need to deal with it in this order. And the phrase is that you need to avoid removal unless there's a material problem with meeting the objectives of development. So this is what we get from our clients all the time is, well, this I'm kind of, as my example, I'll use there's a VCAT case from Hume that came out late April that talked about avoidance and minimizing, but basically that on an industrial estate, the proponents said they couldn't avoid because the whole site was zoned industrial, and it wasn't appropriate to minimize because it would just leave a little small grassland reserve with no linkage to other sites. And so they proposed offsetting the entire loss of a hectare. Now that's usually what happens because even in that case, there was discussion about, well, was there strategic planning involved? And it's a good example because the member in that case said, oh, there was strategic planning that said this was important for industrial land. But when I read this in the decision today that somebody sent me, I was like, yes, but they didn't consider the strategic value of, and they didn't actually know that native veg was present at that point when they decided that land was zoned industrial, because it's basically from the 1990s that they zoned the land. And too often in the past, we have this across Victoria, that zonings for intensive use were decided long ago, but kept in every decision since then, even when they were made with little assessment of native veg, and no more assessment has worked. So I'll do a little tangent here. If only we could get every shire to consider the sites with conflicts, where there's native veg of significance and zonings that are in conflict, that every shire has them. Every municipality has these, but they're never a priority to deal with in rezonings or anything like that, or planning amendments, because it is the Planning and Development Act after all, isn't it? Not the Planning and Environment Act. I could joke, but where I want to go now is, well, let me talk about native veg, the exemptions for native veg. And can you see this list? Is this? Yep. So I'm not going to go into all of them, but there's an important thing to be clear about, is that there's a bunch of clearing occurring out there that doesn't need a permit. And this is just the beginning, the actual guidance. So there's a guidance document there that's like 6 pages. I'll go to the first one. There's a bunch. The one that always pisses me off, to be honest, if I can get on my high horse again, if I'm not already there, is this one for exemptions for dwellings for bushfire protection. And this comes in essentially creating defendable space for a house or dwelling in most zonings besides green wedge, rural conservation is not affected. Is not exempt, but anything under farming, urban, rural living, etc., is all the clearing associated with creating defendable space is exempt from permit. And so even when the house requires a permit under the BMO, for example, and I always found this a bit bizarre because planners taught me, I spent 30 years getting taught by planners that you have to take, the principle in planning is, and I started working on bushland sites very early in my career, so I understood this, is I had government keep telling me, planners and government say, you must take account of all consequential clearing, of all clearing associated. And that's what must be considered in a planning permit application, is that, that all, not just the house, but the defendable space, the driveway, the shed, all that. But in whatever wisdom, I won't call it wisdom because I don't think it's wisdom, but this came in 2014 under the values. And so nowadays we're still, that we have clients who can basically clear a hectare of ground without a permit and without an offset because of this exemption when it's on a farm or that kind of thing. The other ones I want to go to just to highlight this, because offsets are weird things. There's a road safety exemption and a railways exemption and a utilities exemption. Now, I want to lump all those together because they're implemented, those exemptions are implemented by agreements. So VIC roads or their other bodies like Regional Roads Victoria, or railways, or various also certain council and any council, and then utilities like water utilities or power utilities. They can make agreements with, they have to have written agreements, but and they get exemptions from clearing roadside vegetation and railside vegetation and utility and vegetation around the utilities, as long as they accumulate. It's the same thing for Crown land exemptions, so I should put that in. They don't need a permit to clear native veg, but the policy is that they need to accumulate, they need to calculate and accumulate the record of how much native veg they've removed, and then offset it voluntarily, quote unquote, once a year and so on. And I'm not sure how that reporting, I've not seen reporting about that process, but that's, the exemptions are actually a really important issue to understand, because there's a lot of clearing occurring without permit. Some of it is still being offset, and that's kind of it's a complicated subject in itself. Let me go back. The other point I'd like to make about this too is that there's a lot of confusion. This goes to one of the negatives of offsets, is that I'll go back to this, that you have less habitat by the end. Is that what happens? And a lot of people in the room, in the metaphysical room here, will know this, but you can clear a site, you can get a permit to clear a site, and then and that's the lost site, and the offset site will be similar habitat or something like that, and it will already exist, but then it will be permanently protected as an offset and managed intensively for 10 years, and in theory managed to that higher level of habitat quality in perpetuity. But in the end, you still have less actual habitat on the ground, even though some of what's left that's permanently protected is in better condition. So that's one of the negatives. But this is actually, this whole principle is partly one of the problems, is that one of the critiques from members of the public is, well, wasn't this bush already protected? That's the offset site. And the point I want to make is that unfortunately it's not. That all these exemptions I've talked about, actually I haven't talked about enough of the exemptions. I should get into some of these. Let me open this up for you, because the guidance is immense. Like farmers get a lot of room, for example. Here's a long list. I won't go into them, but here's the exemptions guidance. Farmers get a lot of room to along boundaries. So for example, you can see on this list here, existing buildings and works in the farming zone can be exempt. Fences on boundaries are exempt. Fire breaks are exempt. Harvesting, this is the big one, harvesting for timber production on public land and private land is exempt. So the point I'm getting at is that there is great benefit in permanent protection of bushland and native vegetation with explicit management plans for offset to enhance their habitat, because this is the list of what can happen to remnant veg. Some people might say, I've highlighted 52.17. It tells us you need a permit to clear native veg, except when it's exempt. Well, the problem is there's lots of native veg out there on private land and public land, but there is no obligation for positive management. For example, environmental weeds can be allowed to go crazy on private or public land because they're not noxious. But once a site becomes an offset site, any weeds would need to be managed, for example. And I've been, as a consultant, I've been to plenty of properties in which I'm sure the people weren't breaking the law, but they were slowly destroying their habitat, the habitat they had on their property, so that they might not have consciously been doing it for development options, or they may have. You know, you can't look into people's heads, but basically, the example I give, every time I went up, we did a site in Wood End, and it was a grazing paddock out the back of a nursing home. And there's big giant trees through it, lots of grass in the understory. The owners of this nursing home grazed donkeys. Every time a big tree fell over, they cut it up for firewood. And I can tell you, I saw this site over a few years, but they were slowly but surely legally destroying it, that native vegetation. And that's what's possible. Now, I've sat in VCAT as an expert and said, that's what's possible. And people, I've had questions from lawyers saying, how can you say that? I was like, well, because it's true that all these exemptions exist on private land in particular, and that it is actually more than possible for people to slowly but inevitably destroy native vegetation with under all the exemptions that make their life easier, that the government, in effect, didn't want to threaten some of this use, and so on. So that's an important background to understand, and that's where the good comes, some of the good, if there is some, out of offsets. Let me tell you another joke, since it's crossed my mind, and if I seem to be going all over the place, it's because I am, sort of. But last year, someone got up at the National Offsets Conference. I think they were from Queensland, but they said, my passion is offsets, and I like to work in this field. And I was like, I wanted to raise my hand and said, but aren't they just a necessary evil, not something to be excited about? Because I live and breathe offsets almost daily, but I don't consider, I'm not passionate about them. I just think they're a necessary evil. So sorry, another tangent, but I was remembering that joke, and I'll get back to that. So the exemptions are really important to understand. And there is, if you travel around your region or the state and you see lots of remnant vegetation on private land, that is technically protected, because if it's on a block over 4,000 square meters and so on, you can't just bulldoze it, but you can actually slowly degrade it and even slowly destroy it legally. And that's the problem. And that's why the principle of offsets being permanently protected with covenants or Section 69 agreements or Section 173 agreements is really important. Now, sorry if I spent a bit of time on that subject, but I'll go for the planning processes now. So when you need a permit, and what I'll do for that is actually I'll take you through an actual an actual permit, an actual report that we've written for a site. Now, it's not on the plains, which I'm sorry about. I don't have any good examples at the moment, but this one's from Nillumbik, and I'll show you the map first. So this is, now I'm going to just tell you a little bit of the process of how we go.
Can't see anything. We're still on
Right.
the exemptions.
No worries.
Yeah.
Now, all this, I'll show you this first. There's the guidelines. This is the documents in which, this is kind of our Bible as consultants. You need to understand the guidelines for removal, destruction, and lopping of native vegetation.
You're not sharing, Lincoln.
Now I am.
Yeah, you are. Yep.
So this is a really important document. And in the short time I have tonight, I'll just simply say, if you want to understand offsets, make sure you read these and make sure you relate them to any planning permits or rezonings you're regarding, looking at, participating in, etc. So this is the guidelines. And there is another document which I'll share. Let's see. Now let me leave that subject there, and I'll go to this one. I've got an actual plan, and I'll go to this one. So this is one I'm working on up in Christmas Hills, and I'll show you the table of contents first. This is actually handed out. This general format was handed out by Delwitt people.
Sorry, Lincoln. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Here we go. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Yep. So this is the table of contents, and you can see it's got, we begin with intro and methods. We go to results, what's present. Now, what's important to highlight here in any assessment, we are obligated as ecological consultants on sites with native veg to look at flora and fauna separate from vegetation. And that they influence the decision, but they don't, and they can actually flow into offsets, but they tend to be separate from the actual vegetation assessment. So that's why you get your own section in these things. Then we go through how what the relevant policy and legislation is, and how and what the implications of these different policy and legislation might be for the developments that's proposed. Now, the next section we do is the implications of the proposed development, which you'll see on here. You've got an overview. Was there strategic planning done? Because that can be important. Was it decided? The strategic planning issue is an interesting one, because like the example I was giving earlier about a VCAT case from late April that was talking about the strategic planning was done in a sense to make that industrial development was appropriate and important. If you remember, some of you will remember the Ajax Road case, and if you attended the hearing, there was an awful lot of that strategic planning context from the proponent who wanted to destroy the grassland, because their point of view was, well, a strategic decision was made that this was state significant industrial land, and that's why we should be able to destroy whatever's in the way, whatever habitat's in the way. So when there's strategic planning considered, I found myself recently going, well, I'm not thinking the wrong way. I always thought strategic planning had to do with native vegetation and knowing where it was and making good decisions around it to protect it. But actually, it can also mean making strategic decisions about styles or kinds of development that you are important for certain spaces. And in some cases, that can override the significance of any remnant vegetation. Now, I'll flow to 5. The next one here, we always need to explain how we avoid and minimize, and then we calculate the proposed losses and a native vegetation impact analysis. I'll actually show you that. I'll go through the report and show you those sections. Now, and you'll see here we get to offset targets and offset strategy. All this is very important and necessary. But sometimes in Nillumbik, we almost always do land management plans. Sometimes they're offset management plans. They're not always required by other shires. So let me flow through this document, and I'll go straight to the offset section. Actually, let me. We describe, first I'll show you this, is if you want to resist an application, like a proposal, one of the key obligations is accurate mapping of the habitat zones in a site and photographs of that habitat and a score of that habitat. There is an exception to this. This is what's required. You might be familiar with the 3 levels of assessment: basic, intermediate, and detailed. This procedure of the photographs are required for basic, but habitat scoring is not. It's actually a default mechanism. So if it's just a little scrap of native vegetation, less than half a hectare, a few trees, you can just go to the NVIM site, the Native Vegetation Information Management System, and simply go in and map your little bits of native veg, and you'll get a report out that actually says, you're clearing so little that your offset's this small little amount, or you're clearing enough that you need an expert to do a detailed report. And that's when scoring is required in intermediate and detailed. And I know I've been involved in VCAT cases. I've had several in the last couple of years where people opposing the development hired me, and I found in both cases that the vegetation assessments were inadequate, and that was partly how I know at least one of my clients have, were successful in resisting a development, and there's another one that hasn't been decided yet that was pretty critical, but that they just simply hadn't done a very good investigation, and had gotten some basic things wrong about the assessment. So I'll give a tip for any of you participating in these things is that if it's a really important site, get it in the actual assessment and even the offset calculation, get your own ecological consultant who does this work, because it's a complex procedure that if someone like myself who's been doing it for 20 years reviews something, we see a lot more in the assessment and in the analysis than you will as a layperson who's unfamiliar, because every single line through a report like this is a decision that is made by a consultant like myself, but also it's a decision that's made and with consideration of the law and practicality and so on. So let me flow on to the next section that I want to look at. Now, avoiding minimizing, this is all important. In this case, my client has a hard time on this site. It's a big site, and he just wants to build a house where it's already cleared, but he's not getting much help out of council so far. So that's why we paid special attention to avoiding minimizing, and then we flow to offsets. And basically we try to explain, and I think this should be the obligation all the time, is to do, you need to, it's quite clear in planning law and in VCAT case precedents that every proponent has to make a good case. They have to cooperate. So I can tell you most of the time what happens is that a developer goes there, they decide they want to do something, whether it's one house on a small block or a 100-lot subdivision or a 300-lot subdivision. They have a development in mind, and then they design it, and then council says, wait a second, you need to get, we want to know about the native veg. And then it often doesn't get changed, but I can assure you the law, it's quite principle, it's a quite clear principle in planning law under the Planning and Environment Act that you've got to demonstrate avoidance and minimization. And I like to talk about this too. It's not just about, it might not be about square meters. It might be, well, we'll clear 3 or 4 small trees over here, but we'll protect that large tree over there. This is what an ecologist can help a developer do, is kind of make better choices, or go, all right, like what I've done too is gone, all right, we've got a whole site. It's 3 or 4 different habitat zones, and one is much less value than another, or that the scores are quite different, or there's different values, and we should go onto the part of the site with less ecological values. Too often, us consultants don't get the time to do that. Is the developer just says, I want what I want. But if you're opposing development, you can take advantage of that and go, well, did they really make the effort to avoid and minimize? Now, where I'm going with this, you'll see on this page, there's losses of habitat zones, and then tree losses. And tree losses are when there's individual scattered trees. Sometimes on bushland sites, they're lost in defendable space, but we still use them as scattered trees. So let me get to the key part. So now this is the vegetation impact analysis. In this case, we got to this little table is from the guidelines, as you can see quoted there. I'll increase that for you. And you have the zone. Now, I won't explain it. Basically, if you have location 1 is the least, risk, location 3 is the highest risk. In this case, in this document, my client's got to clear about 9,000 square meters, almost not clear, but modify. And so he got to detailed assessment required because 0.5 hectares or more was affected, and it was in location 1. So we get to detailed, and that's what this report is all about. But once you get to detailed, the detailed section, you need to actually get a professional to actually do the job. Now, as I walk through, I'll go through quickly. We record the extent of impact from proposed development. We summarize how much is lost, how many hectares, how many trees. Again, going through the steps of what we've done to avoid impacts. And we come up with the native vegetation to be removed, but also the offset target. Now, this is important to explain because it goes into some of the difficult issues. So in this one, you'll see that you go to, in this case, he needs general habitat units, and the offset must be within Port Phillip or Western Port, CMA, or Nillumbik Shire. Then it has a strategic biodiversity value score, and sometimes large trees are included. Now, I'll explain here that sometimes this is the territory in which you'll see here that general habitat units are required. The other kind of unit that's required in, now, hopefully this works for me to go. Sorry, I'll go back to that and show you later. There's species-specific habitat units that might be required too. Now, how they work on this site, in this example I've given you, they weren't given up, because how are the species-specific units? For most offsets, you need general habitat units. It means that the habitat you're clearing is not the habitat of, is not enough habitat of an FFG VROT doesn't exist anymore, Victorian rare or threatened, but NFFG listed species, that not enough has been cleared to need a more like for like offset. So I tend to think it's pretty inadequate, but that most offsets stay in this general habitat units area. And so it actually does occur, and I've had permits that have this happen where, in theory, you could clear native grassland and the offset could be in mountain ash forest, because if the species-specific habitat unit is not triggered, then you don't get like for like, and I'll explain this in. Let's see if I can. Need to use this other document to show you. Just a moment. Now here's a page, and let me. So what happens under the state system is you can have two types of offsets. The species offset is when the removal of native vegetation has a significant impact on the habitat for a rare or threatened species. And that's when species offsets must compensate for removal of that particular species of habitat. General offset is required when the removal of native vegetation does not have a significant impact on any habitat for a rare or threatened species. Now, what happens mostly is you get these general offsets. Because how species offset work, the species specific ones, you have to clear more than 0.2, sorry, let me get the number right, 0.005% of the mapped habitat of a species. Once you cross that threshold, then you need a species specific offset for that species. Now, there are some species that never get a species specific offset. I always use the example powerful owls. Powerful owl habitat is incredibly extensive because they need up to 8,000 hectares of habitat in a wild landscape, a wild forested landscape, up to 800 or 1,000 hectares in urban Melbourne because possums are so common. So their habitat is almost everywhere, and you almost never get to a species specific unit required for powerful owl because of that. In my experience, you get to species specific for really rare things, to be honest, sometimes there's species I've never heard of. Like I had one long ago in one long forest mallee in like 2015, and two species. I was familiar with the genera, but not the species. I'd never heard of the species before, but they had such a limited extent of their habitat importance mapping that we easily got to 0.005% loss of their mapped habitat. And then we had to find credits for those species. And they become hard to find because since they had such limited habitat before any clearing occurred in their habitat, in their where they occur, then they're even harder to find an appropriate offset because they had limited distribution to begin with. And so that's how, like for like, the system as we have it now can kind of trip over a threshold and be more like for like. It's just that most often not it isn't like for like that way. So let me go back. So just to explain that, and I'll go back to the one example I've got. Can you see that? So can you see that new one? Yes. I'll see. I think I've figured out how to do this now. So you can see the target here is about half a dozen, about 0.596 general habitat units and some large trees. What's super critical is the offset strategy. So if you're looking at development, the offset strategy is all important. Because that's about how a proponent for a project is going to find their offset. Now, what if you can't, this is also really important because if the proponent can't find an offset, that is grounds for knocking back the proposal. Even if everything else lines up, all kinds of other things in the planning system lines up, if the offset cannot be found, then DELWP is obligated to object, and councils are too, but DELWP do it easier. They are obligated to object because if you can't find the offset, then you'll basically get a Clayton's permit anyway. I am confused by this because I personally have many cases in which DELWP will object when I can't definitively find an offset. But I get stories. I have people ring me up and go, like a few years ago, somebody rang me up and said, we got a permit. We need to find 1,600 large trees. And I was like, how did you get a permit to clear 1,600 large trees? That's just really extreme. And to me, it's a kind of permit that should have never gotten through. And I still don't know how it occurred, but there's still permits getting through that are probably that due consideration about whether or not the offset is truly available is not actually made very often. But this offset strategy can be really important because if an offset can't be found, and that can be demonstrated in the decision phase of a planning process, then refusal is necessary according to the planning law. Now, if I go back to, unfortunately, general habitat credits, depending on how you look at it, fortunately or unfortunately, if you're a developer, fortunately, general habitat credits are really common. So if you only need general habitat units, then Port Phillip, basically those kind of units are just dead common in the system. Species specific units are a lot less common, and it depends on what they are. And sometimes large trees can be problematic too, because you might not be able to find enough of what you need. Now, the other thing to point out is this minimum strategic biodiversity score is it goes up to about 1,000, so 0.999, 0.494, just as an example, is relatively high. It will, there'll be a lot of offset sites won't be suitable because they will be less than that score. So anyway, that's how the offset targets work. This is all under the state system. So you have to find those credits, and through the offset strategy, we often demonstrate we can find the credits by basically looking up. We can look online and see what kind of credits are available for sale immediately on the Native Vegetation Credit Register. So let's see, I'll show you the maps, just so I showed you an example, but I'll show you maps just to illustrate this example.
Lincoln, I'm just
yes.
aware that we've been going an hour. It's
I know,
time flies when we're all riveted, but
I hope so.
If there are key points then that you want to jump to,
I will. So here's some. So this is the case in Nillumbik. Just how it works is the whole site was mostly, this bit in the center was mostly cleared with very little native vegetation, and old development had occurred. This circle is unfortunately the defendable space. They needed to build a house in the center, and the rest of the site will be protected. But you can also see how the vegetation kind of sorts itself out, is that you know, you have habitat zones and gullies that are very similar and so on. So let me flow on to let me talk a little bit about Commonwealth offsets here, because you might have questions about those. And it goes, well, how do Commonwealth offsets vary with, now I'll stop sharing and then start sharing, because now some of you will know that the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act is completely separate to the state system. So they act in parallel, and if you need a permit under the state act, the State Planning and Environment Act, you may need a permit under the EPBC Act. And when we say they're parallel, they still have they still connect in effect. If you go all the way to an environmental effects statement, if a project's that big, we now have a system in which the state makes an agreement with the Commonwealth, and EPBC matters of national ecological significance are dealt with in an EES at the same time that the state system is dealt with. But usually they're separate. But generally how it works is, what a developer will do is go through the whole state system, and then apply for an EP and go, all right, I got this offset, and I'm going to do I'm going to protect this vegetation over here. I'm going to protect some on site maybe. And what they live in hope of is that they can do a referral to the Commonwealth, and that everything they have to do under the state will be adequate compensation for the Commonwealth offset. Now, that isn't always the case. And it's often because Commonwealth offsets are done completely differently, is that they're focused on species. They're also focused on hectares of habitat. And so, for example, if you clear a hectare of golden sunmoth habitat, you might be expected to protect and manage 4 or 5 hectares of golden sunmoth habitat. If you clear growling grass frog habitat, you might be expected to restore in fact, I just saw a project like this yesterday that we quoted for. They cleared a few hectares of growling grass frog habitat in a paddock in Epping, and then the offset is basically a series of growling grass frog wetlands up and down Edgar's Creek. And the hope is, and they have this complicated plan of like 50 pages in which they will build the GGF wetlands and then hope that the frogs will hop in over time. I've just summarized a 50-page plan, but that's in effect how, in effect, the Commonwealth offsets are much more bespoke. Is that generally what happens is you have to prepare a management plan that identifies the losses, makes a case, identifies the offset, and then makes a case about why the offset site is adequate. And it can be a lot higher obligation than the state sometimes. But also there's another principle to think about too, which is there is a principle, it's kind of convention rather than law, but that if you have if you have native grassland and then you have a striped-legged lizard, for example, or golden sun moth on a site, and the habitat is overlapping, you can go to an offset site and overlap the offsets for state or federal, but only if that habitat overlapped for state or federal matters on the site of loss. They can be layered on the site of offset if you do it that way. That's the only case in which it's allowed. Usually proponents of projects clearing native veg, if they have matters of national environmental significance to deal with, that might be a completely different kind of action and bespoke later to the state system, which is a system of advanced offsets. So I've stopped here in this page because you can read about lots of different things. So under the federal system, avoid, mitigate, or minimize, depending on how you want to see it. Mitigate means actions to avoid impacts, and then offset. And it's still the mitigation hierarchy, and that's the obligation. There is some better things, like there is indirect offsets in the federal system. Like I've had some cases in the last couple of years in which I participated in VCAT cases for state planning permits in which indirect impacts were part of the decision making, but unfortunately, indirect impacts, there's no system under the state system to take them into account. So I'll give an example. It's a VCAT case called Parkley versus Strathbogie Shire Council. And they wanted to build Parkley wanted to build a caravan park right next to a backwater where freshwater turtles and barogas nested. And they wanted to build a boat ramp and a dock into this backwater of the Goulburn River. And there's all these logs. There was barogas breeding there when I inspected it. And also lots of freshwater turtles, which most are listed as endangered. There's some that are in good. Some species are doing well, but most are doing badly. And they were going to have 1,500 people staying here for 2 months out of the year and canoeing. And I was like, well, it's an indirect impact on a significant habitat of threatened species, not accounted for as an offset in the state system, but accounted for in the federal system. So now, where am I go with this? I'll go back to, now can you see that? That was your kind of very quick overview of the offset system, but let me talk about the problems with offsets as I see them. And some of you already know this, that I've already talked about the like for like scenario, and that's actually quite important as a principle. There is some international studies or international reports I've read about offsets across the country, across the world. And one of the principles is that offsetting should be like for like, that if you're clearing certain kinds of habitat, you should protect certain kinds of habitat. Now, we have that system under the state system, and we have it in the Commonwealth EPBC Act. In the state system, I tend to think the threshold to be more specific, like for like, that line between the requirement for a general habitat unit versus a species specific, I think that threshold's a bit too high, is my opinion. It's actually very hard to get. There is a like for like component in the state system, but the threshold to get to a strong like for like is maybe a bit high. To me, the next problem of offsets is, and you'll, as mostly, since I'm speaking to a room full of greenies, so to speak, I'm sure I'm not insulting any of you by calling you that, but the system is actually, we see the clearing in front of us. So if you live somewhere and there's a development near your home or in your territory that you're attached to that remnant habitat, that site, you'll see it getting cleared, but you'll never see the offset, because offsets tend to be anonymous. It's somewhere in your shire or it's somewhere in the CMA, but you don't, and you might know where it is, but you don't see it. And to me, that's a big problem with offsets, is that the clearing is local, but the offsets are so often unseen by the community who sees the clearing. I've covered this before too, this problem, but that, you know, that habitat is, that offsetting is too easily seen as the solution for development. And this is the problem. I guess I see it. I used to teach a 1-day course on native veg and planning law. And I always began the day by saying there's 3 kinds of planning permit applications out there. There's the ones that are generally acceptable with almost no tweaking because, you know, everybody's mostly happy. Then there's the ones that's the first category. There's always a few of them out there. There's plenty of those occurring all the time. The second one is applications that need tweaking but are generally acceptable. And maybe you, like that category, the second category might be things like, yeah, there's a bit of native veg on a site and the developer wants to do a subdivision, but has basically ignored it. They've just gone to a surveyor and said, lay me out a grid. And then they get told by council or an ecologist, wait, but you got a little veg in the corner. Let's protect that in a reserve. Let's do this. Now, those are the ones, yeah, with some tweaking, they'll be generally acceptable. The third category, I think, is, and I'll be blunt on this, are the stupid ones that just should never see the light of day. Too much clearing, too much impact. And I'll also say publicly too, that too often, these are the kind of developments that politicians come out before the work's even been done and says, don't worry, we're going to get this done. And that's what I mean by offsets are seen as too easily the solution for development. And even a case study of this, I mentioned, I saw Dan Andrews say when he, in the press conference, when he launched Northeast Link, don't worry, we're going to offset all the impacts. And I actually did a critique of offsets from the Northeast Link, and some bright spark from Northeast Link decided that all the indigenous trees that have been planted the last 30 or 40 years, there's an exemption. Let me go back a little bit. There's an exemption for public land and private land that if you plant an indigenous tree with public money for biodiversity purposes, it needs a permit for removal. But if you planted it for amenity purposes, it doesn't need a permit for removal. Well, for Northeast Link, there was an estimated 25,000 trees to be removed. And some bright spark said they were all planted for amenity, every last one of them. Even though for 30 or 40 years, well, since I'm stretching time, aren't I? Since the 1980s, people have planted local indigenous trees in Banyule and Nillumbik municipalities. And to me, I was like, well, that's just wrong, but they shouldn't have been offset. The Northeast Link only offsets about a dozen trees, dozen big red gums, and 25,000 trees don't get offset because of that exemption. So even though they have promised to plant lots of them. So I have already covered the point 2, that less habitat is present afterwards. Let me go on to some of the good things. And then I'll end with some other propositions, is that, and I introduced this point, I once went to a conference on private land in Tasmania, and about 10 or 15 years ago, and a lawyer got up and said, the offset system sucks and we shouldn't do this. It just isn't adequate, and it shouldn't happen. And I wanted to raise my hand, even though I didn't have time, to say, I do remember before we had offsets, is that politicians and councils and responsible authorities generally decided to let native vegetation be cleared, and we didn't have offsets. So that's what's always going to be tempting, is that there's always going to be scraps of clearing that will occur, and we'll still have people in positions of power making decisions to clear it. And that's unfortunate. That's why it's a necessary evil. And that offsets, the good things about offsets is sometimes they actually cost so much money that they, I've had projects in which the offset would cost as much as the development itself. And I can tell you, when that happens, that development gets canned. But also, it's just good that we're doing offsets. It's generating money for conservation and for permanent protection of land, as I talked about earlier. Now, the other good thing, I think, what I've observed as a consultant over time, we do hundreds of planning permit applications each year and do native veg assessments. And really often what happens is it's like little scraps, that a few indigenous trees in somebody's backyard, or you'll have a developed landscape, like a mostly cleared landscape, but for some incredibly difficult reason, somebody's got to clear just a bit on their property. Now, what I call this is, I've seen where there's an awful lot of little scraps of native veg, and it's a shame that they are removed, but for whatever reason they are. And they often are then collectivized. All those little scraps are collectivized into bigger offset sites. Doesn't always happen, but that is what's occurring, is that these little scraps of clearing accumulate into lots of credits that need to be purchased. And then there'll be basically sites on farms or beyond the halo effect of cities like Melbourne, that a bunch of sites of native vegetation will be protected permanently, and substantial management works will occur. And to me, that is a plus, that it just helps me feel better, that what I've observed is there's lots of little scraps of native veg that are lost, but they do add up to protection elsewhere. Now, the last thing, I guess, it's this issue I talked about earlier too, that the lack of an offset can be a reason for refusal of a permit. But that's a good thing. But also it's a matter of that if the loss is too great, and we're getting to where even a hectare or two is too great. There are some thresholds, like an EES can be required, which is a pretty high level assessment of a project, if more than 10 hectares of native vegetation are to be cleared, or proposed to be cleared. Now, to me, this is a pretty good thing, that I know we're still getting lots of native veg cleared, and sometimes in places that are already buggered, in effect, already mostly cleared. But we are getting into the territory where a few hectares of clearing is problematic in the planning system, and that permits are refused on that level of clearing. And I know it's still sometimes incredibly significant habitat, but at least we're in that territory now, is that there isn't many applications out there, as I sometimes joke, but it's actually serious. When I was an expert witness for the objectors to the Fingerboards mine in East Gippsland last year, that project had 300 hectares to be cleared of native vegetation. It was knocked back. the only authorities that get near to that amount of only mines. Apparently, there was a mine, another mineral sands mine in the Wimmera that cleared 50. Peninsula Link cleared 50 hectares of native veg, and Vic Roads, or Major Roads Victoria, about the only authority nowadays that will actually get that much land cleared. And that's a good thing, is at least we're in that end of the spectrum still, even though we might have further to go. Now, I'll make one last point, because I'm talking way over and taking you all the time. Hopefully it's been good. My second to last point there, are we getting to the end of possible offsetting for certain ecosystems? And the answer is an enthusiastic yes from me. I'll give the example is in 2021 and 22, we had a project of Geelong. You guys, the Grassy Plains Network has already commented on this, but there was a project in which they wanted us to source, to figure out where they could get offsets for their western and northern growth areas. We looked at what the native veg was in that area, where they might, and a lot of it was native grassland. Also, there's a bunch of species-specific units. So in that particular piece of work, we highlighted that native grassland offsets are hard to get now, whether they're federal or local offsets. In local offsets, it's not so, in state offsets, it's not so important because they were general habitat units, a lot of what was needed. But a lot of people have permits now. We hear rumors all the time. I hear rumors through both my businesses, the offset provider and the ecological consultancy, that there are people out there with permits to remove grassland and striped locust lizard habitat and GSM habitat and so on, and they can't find their offset for years sometimes. Now that's a problem. That's a problem for them. They shouldn't have been given the permit in the first place, probably, but it's a problem for them, but it's also a problem. The problem goes back to the willingness of responsible authorities to actually grant permits. And we need a bit more hesitation at that stage, because that's a big issue. Now, but back to this Geelong thing, the Geelong northern and western growth areas, our basic premise, we also identified that they needed a bunch of species-specific units for about half a dozen rare flora species. We then looked at where that habitat was mapped, and all the habitat for those species was mapped within an hour of Western Melbourne, basically through the Brisbane ranges from Geelong into Bacchus Marsh. And we had to highlight in our report that, this is, if you're within an hour of Melbourne, people hesitate to do offsets, and all the blocks are small mostly and so on. And so we basically made the case to Geelong City Council that you're going to have trouble if you develop all this territory today, you would have trouble getting the offsets. And you might be better off having a more conscious, well thought out process of doing a strategic assessment. Now, there's been some controversy I don't want to weigh into. Since all this was announced, Geelong's announced it. They've taken our advice, and I think it's good advice that they took. And I know publicly there's some concerns about how they're addressing it and the data they're releasing and so on. But to me, a strategic assessment will be useful in that regard for the northern and western growth areas of Geelong, because the issue highlights that we are getting to the end of possible offsetting for certain ecosystems, like native grassland of the VDP. Now, I'll make one point, and that I'm not sure if responsible authorities and politicians realize this much yet. They don't want to realize it because offsetting is, like I said, a necessary evil. I think plenty of environmentalists, and I know they've proposed this over the years, can't we just ban clearing? Well, it's going to be really hard work. I'd like to do it too. I'm an environmentalist, but it's going to be really hard work if we get around to it. But basically, offsets are part of the process of compensating for the inevitable development and loss that does occur. But hopefully we keep the scraps low, the amount of clearing quite low, and have a logical planning process, and that offsets I actually think of the day in which we need to stop offsetting as well, that we basically stay on our current disturbance footprint for development, and that we clear as little as possible, but not sure when we'll get there. So I think that's a good introduction to offsetting, I hope. And if I haven't, I'll go back to Adrian and see if he wants to open it for some questions.
Thank you, Lincoln. That was extensive and excellent. Thank you very much. Perhaps you could stop sharing your screen there, and we can see everyone's faces and so on. Yes, indeed. I'm sure we have a stack of questions. We probably have gone over time, so let's not. Well, let's see how the conversation goes anyway. But we have to be aware.
And I know there's things I didn't cover.
There's always things, yes.
Because it's such a huge subject. If I had a whole day, I couldn't cover it very well.
That's right. If people want to just unmute themselves and ask away, that would be great. Or you can put it in the chat. Either way. While people are thinking, Colin and Wendy Cook ask if permits can be withdrawn if the work is not undertaken within a certain time.
I can answer that two ways. Under state law, no. And this is the point I didn't make, is that when a developer who has a permit to clear buys an offset, that's an advance offset usually. Sometimes it might be boutique. They might go to a specific offset seller. In fact, that's what I've done as a company. We've actually figured out somebody needs a big lump of offsets. We actually go and find them. But usually what a developer does is just go to the Native Vegetation Credit Register and buys off the register. And those are credits, and those credits on the register are from properties in which the owners have agreed to offset management plans are implementing them and are being monitored by Trust for Nature, DELWIP, DECA, or a council, in theory. When a developer buys those offset credits, they've essentially done their mission. And that is one good thing from a developer point of view. I do say this to clients, is because they ask me, is there any blowback if let's say the people who are creating the offset credits don't do what they're supposed to do? And I say, no, under the state system, it's better for developers. Once they pay that lump of money, sometimes a big lump of money, they're done and there's no going back. But federal offsets are different. And this has occurred in which if a federal offset will have a management plan and might say the objectives is to improve the amount of striped legless lizard on a site, or to improve the quality of the grassland. And if all that hasn't been achieved as by year 5 or 10, the Commonwealth reserves the right to force a developer to go and get another offset, because they will have destroyed that habitat that they got the permit for.
Okay.
So in general, there isn't a mechanism to avoid, to give a permit back, so to speak, or give up a permit, because it's kind of designed, the legal obligations are there that the offset must go through, and it generally does. Okay.
I can see Bonnie Gilman has her hand up. Bonnie, do you want to unmute yourself and speak to us?
Thanks, Adrian. Lincoln, thank you for your exhaustive
Yes, I would think so.
Maybe exhausting. Lincoln, it is exhausting, because it I won't say the rude word, but it messes with a lot of our greenie minds. Yeah. One of the things I'll ask you, though, the idea of net gain and net loss. There was a Trust for Nature thing today at the museum that I went to, and I spoke to the new CEO there, and I said, look, people like us that wonder about you guys and how your business model is based on offsets. And she was introducing herself, and she'd been talking about how exciting it is that the new international market in offsets has arrived, so that places overseas can show how they can demonstrate how much they value the Australian nature by paying for it or whatever. Is it only greenie types like us now that talk about net gain, net loss with regards offsets? Do you ever hear it mentioned by other people?
No, what's more mentioned, and this is where this international market comes in, and I've been talking to some people about it, is that it's more about, it won't be so much about specific development, but about offsetting the impacts of their production, for example. But it won't really be no net gain or no net loss, because and if you want to call it greenwashing, it may be appropriate, but it's more about, maybe a company says, well, we get all our stuff, all our product from farms, but we make sure the farm actually protects remnant vegetation or fences off their creeks. Has a farmers are developing a sustainability index. It has been talked about for a long time, and we're getting closer, but it's still not there. So where I'm going with this is to say, I think that international market, it's nothing like the planning market, where, like what I've just talked about. It's essentially a volunteer market, and it will be consumers. You and I can talk about this. The room of people we're in, the metaphorical virtual room, is we're deep down in the detail of the Victorian planning system and native vegetation. But that international system will be more about basically getting the general consumer to feel better. A company will go, the Bank of Australia, they own a property in the Wimmera, but they get Greening Australia to manage, and they plant trees on it, and it's remnant veg. And then they use it as propaganda or marketing, whatever you want to call it. They say, we're looking after, for every account we plant a tree. And, you know, as an ecologist, that doesn't guarantee, I call it tree guard dreaming. A tree guard and a tree growing doesn't guarantee habitat. But
Lincoln, I know someone who owns part of that block, and they were telling me today that there are feral goats all over it, that they're planning to put cameras on it. So yeah, and a lot of offset money goes into that block.
Well, I hope the Trust for Nature is on them. Like I have an offset block that when I purchased it, it had a herd of 30 goats left, because the previous owners had goats and they couldn't get the last 30 of them, but we've shot them all out. We don't have them anymore after 5 years. So we've done so they need to, that's what stewardship should work, is Trust for Nature or DELWIP are the stewards. And I've always found them to be quite good. Well, I'm the victim of their stewardship. I'm the customer of their stewardship, and they're both hard asses and cooperative. They make sure we're on track. And
so if I can just, a simple question, there doesn't seem to me any evidence that offsets have led to a net benefit, a net loss, or a net gain of native veg habitat.
Yeah, that's the big critique. I've seen it at conferences. The big critique is that it's not, there is phrases like residual impact and so on, but the offset system was not designed to basically have this direct relationship between adequate mitigation to the losses. It was essentially designed by a bunch of bureaucrats in a room on modeling. This is the state system I'm talking about. And it wasn't really designed to definitively offset the actual loss and definitively increase habitat. It's essentially an accounting tool that does lead to good outcomes to some degree, but your question and the point that comes out of that is we still don't have any real evidence that our offsetting systems actually adequately compensate for the ongoing losses. Now, having said that, in 2013, the state government in Victoria tried to fix something. under net gain, they had the net gain policy, which kind of still exists, but the native veg framework was kind of seen as, and developers kind of were unhappy with this, that saying, well, all the net gain comes from the planning process. But the state government now says, well, we'll do all our programs like bush tender. We'll even fund Trust for Nature to get more covenants. They've done an ongoing basis, ongoing grants, Trust for Nature for that. And through all their tree planting programs and so on, what they're saying now, and have for a few years now, quite a few years, is that it's offsetting that's part of planning. It's the purchase, all the other activities the state does for conservation, including purchasing land still. They still do that. There's a little bit purchased each year. But that, and bush tender and a bunch of others, that all the programs together will result in net gain. And that's not very clear. The reports coming out of government are that that's not happening, but even by their coarse measurement, that's not happening either yet.
Thank you, Lincoln.
We've got a question from Andrew Booth here.
Hi, Andrew.
Hi, Lincoln. Good to hear your insights about the change in the native veg regulations since the native veg framework versus post 2013. Yep. What's your take on the amount of clearing which has been happening since 2013, say per annum, compared with what we had in the 2000s under the native veg framework?
You mean permitted clearing or unpermitted clearing?
Permitted, yeah, not exemption, but permitted clearing, if you have an idea.
It's kind of hard. It would be general impression. You know, having done this, my work now as a consultant for 25, well, almost 30 years, more than 30 years, I do think the game has changed an awful lot. Large clearing is generally not tolerated except for roads and fire breaks, you know, for government in effect. And so I think there is less occurring. You might disagree, like there's always blips, like the Melbourne Strategic Assessment was one in which, you know, they basically, it's a huge blip. There's always thousands of hectares of clearing occurring that was sort of considered, but probably inadequately.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's encouraging then.
Yeah, I think it's better now. We consistently argue over it in VCAT. So, and there's more cases in my experience that when they're appealed and so on, that fail, the permits fail based on native veg removal and unacceptable native veg removal. There's more of those failures now. So I think it's getting better. It's just not as, it's not what we would like.
And have we got the data? Are they producing reports summarizing the clearing permitted? And
yes, I'm on the native veg reference group. It's a group that DELWIP or DECA now manages, and I represent the Ecological Consultants Association on that reference group. And they did publish last year. I reviewed the report. Unfortunately, some councils are still, in fact, a good rump of councils, something like 10 or 20% of councils are still not reporting the permits for native veg removal that they are granting.
Yeah.
And DELWIP is still having trouble getting that information out of councils sometimes. It might have to do with the fact too that I'll pick on certain councils. Apparently Hepburnshire till a few years ago barely had a permit for removal ever put in. The theory is that basically people just said, and I've seen evidence of this, is that when landholders, the council planners only saw trees as native veg, not as understory. And so if you didn't clear a tree, you didn't need a permit.
The impression Hepburn might have been a bit dodgy even years ago. Yes.
And maybe, I think they've gotten better. I know they're doing permits now. We've done some permits up there. So I know permits are going through, but you'll know this dichotomy is that there's probably a lot of clearing that should require a permit, but is tolerated in rural shires, but it's certainly not tolerated in peri-urban and urban shires. So you do have kind of a two-tier system. The law is the same across that line, like once you go into rural Victoria, regional Victoria, but there's a lot more tolerance for veg removal with than there is in peri-urban Melbourne and Melbourne itself.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
great.
thanks.
All right, perhaps it's getting on. It's almost 8:15. So let's wind up Lincoln's talk now, if we may.